The term creative placemaking is a recent addition to the cultural vocabulary for most of us here in the United States, and it erupted a few years ago at a critical time when, despite the efforts of some extraordinary people working for years on behalf of the arts, cultural advocacy wasn't really getting much traction beyond arguments about economic impact. And those arguments were being increasingly faulted for two reasons. First, because economic impact captures only a portion of the value and significance of the range of activities undertaken by the cultural community. But even darker, the economic impact argument was getting inverted in many quarters into an accusation around gentrification, like the so-called Soho effect, in which artists raise real estate values, turn into avatars of economic inequality, and basically self-immolate. So in championing creative placemaking at the NEA, Rocco and his team catalyzed a number of trends that had begun to percolate in the world of philanthropy. First, a willingness to collaborate as opposed to exclusively staking out an idea or a discipline or a sponsorship approach. Second, an application of more active strategies like challenges and matching grants looking for demonstrable impact. And I'm going to pause for a shameless institutional self-promotion, which is to say that the just announced Bloomberg Philanthropies Public Art Challenge for U.S. cities, which Rocco helped us launch, is designed to have a range of impacts, very much including those aligned with creative placemaking. Third, a growing respect for the effectiveness of public-private partnerships and the unique role of government as a convener. And fourth, an interest not just in traditional ways of consuming culture, say in funding naming opportunities around a venue, but also in how art gets made. The process, behind-the-scenes access, the human scale of creativity. And these are all core dynamics of part of a broader makers movement that manifests itself in things like Smorgasbord and Etsy and all kinds of movements. A friend of mine did note that she was waiting for the manifestation of the artisanal jockstrap, but then one only parodies the things one loves. So tonight's discussion among three of the most gifted, visionary, and effective cultural leaders the U.S. has ever had, Rocco Landesman, Damian Woetzel, and Jamie Bennett, should celebrate a watershed moment in understanding our creative sector and help frame the arts agenda going forward.
Thank you, Kate. Well, it goes without saying that to be framed, as it were, so masterfully sets the bar quite high. But I did it to myself, so I have to live with it. I asked Kate to do this introduction because I know how well she understands all of it. And we all know in New York how well she understands all of it because of all the progress we've seen in the city. During her tenure as cultural commissioner, it overlapped my life as a performing artist at New York City Ballet to my life as a director, producer, and worker in arts plus blank, as I like to say. And in every area, Kate's influence can be felt, and all for the good. So we want to thank you, Kate, and thank you for the introduction. So this is all about, it really is a movement, essentially. The idea of creative placemaking, and as Kate said, this is not new. People have been doing things like this. We stand on the shoulders of many people who have grown this movement, but there was this moment where it took shape, and a nomenclature was formed of creative placemaking, and it became the momentum grew in such ways that we couldn't actually even anticipate. Earlier this evening, these gentlemen sat with a group of Hunter and New School and NYU students talking about how they are, interested in this. And it was kids from urban planning. They were Muse scholars from Hunter. I mean,
there's even a creative placemaking course.
Right, and we learned that there's an actual creative placemaking course at the New School, which came as news to Rocco. And I sensed a lot of pride.
Totally.
Just thought, wow, look at this. This has taken on something. So that's a measurement right there where you say, okay, this is something that did not exist in any way in the way that it does now. And it's thanks to the efforts of Rocco and Jamie, working with Rocco at the NEA and now heading ArtPlace. So I don't think we should spend a lot of time saying ArtPlace is this. We can talk about that as we go. We can say here's what ArtPlace is doing. But I would start by just saying to you, Rocco, is it doing what you hoped? Because earlier we discussed it having, inversions at its heart. The inversion of the arts as a sector is not asking for money, it's giving things. So the arts are going to give something to your community, and that's why we're getting funding. It's about inversions of funding models with foundations banding together for a single cause, which is more unusual than one might think. Is this everything you hoped? More? What is this?
Yes, I knew that I was hoping that it would be a significant funding source for what we call creative placemaking, for using the arts to transform neighborhoods, communities, cities, and that it's a big multiplier of the NEA's funds, which are actually much smaller. So I was hoping this would be a way to create more support for the arts all through the country. What I was hoping, but didn't know whether it would happen or not, was the aspect of the field building, of creating, as you called it, a movement, something that would be bigger than anything we did at the NEA, bigger than ArtPlace. That, as Jamie was saying before, that part of the playbook, part of the lexicon, part of the language of every mayor is now, is the arts, and how the arts can be used to generate, economic activity and civic cohesion and vitality in a place. In some cities, New York City, Chicago, others, that's routine, has been going on for a long time. But to have that to be a national movement recognized and embraced by mayors, especially everywhere, is really gratifying.
I think of that as, there's probably some keys to anything succeeding. And the way you and Jamie speak about mayors, that really is one of the keys to getting this done. And it makes perfect sense when you think of it, politics on the local level. But again, it's an inversion of how things get done. Do we need the federal government? I mean, you're talking about mayors, but you were running the NEA. This was not federal government, though you mined that as well in various ways. Jamie, maybe you could comment on, the individual relationships with mayors, but also what are the other keys to making this actually viable?
Right. So one of the things that I've been asked a lot, because now that we're a funder, we're giving away money and we're asking folks, sort of what are you going to do with it? So we're doing all the project evaluation stuff that grantees hate doing. And then my foundations turned around and started asking me those questions. And so I sort of panicked because it meant I needed to figure out what we were doing. And what we talk about the work of ArtPlace as doing is positioning art and culture as a core sector of community planning and development. And it's both that simple and it's that hard. So our goal is that anytime a mayor or the head of a community development corporation or regional planning organization or any of those folks seats a conversation about the future of its community, we want it to be housing, transportation, art and culture, public safety, open space, all around the table. All is equals, each is a sector that needs planning and investment, and each is a sector that also has a responsibility to contribute to its community's future. And one of the reasons that I think mayors are so key, and just full disclosure, I worked with then Commissioner Kate Levin as part of Mayor Bloomberg's administration, and that sort of gave me my grounding in mayors, is that mayors get it because they live in the communities that they're working on behalf of. They walk down the streets, they know the people, they see the way that an arts event brings a zip and a liveliness to a community. They see the ways that people come out for that. They see the ways that neighborhoods become known by their arts, right? There are many ways that you can sort of know a neighborhood, but a neighborhood can become known by its arts, by the wonderful things to do there. And my predecessor in this job was a woman called Carol Coletta, who's now at the Knight Foundation. And she was interviewing then Mayor of Newark, Cory Booker, and she asked him, she said, Mr. Mayor, what's the single most difficult thing about being mayor? There's a lot of difficult things you do in day, but what's the single most difficult thing? And Mayor Booker thought for a minute and eventually said, getting people to believe that tomorrow can be different.
Hope.
And that when you're sitting in a community, when you're sitting in something that's dealt with an intractable problem, where there's been this sort of thing that will never go away or this momentum that won't change, how do you get people to believe that things can be different? And the arts do that. They give you that zip, they give you that imagination, they give you that inspiration, and you throw some paint on a vacant wall, and all of a sudden you can see that beauty could really exist in that lot.
It's a logical segue in a way. We did a convening, the Aspen Institute Arts Program, that brought together government, arts organizations from Detroit in the spring, and brought in several guests, including Kate, and Jamie, and what you just described sounded quite familiar, actually. You know, there's this looking for hope issue. But sometimes it doesn't really come from government. So this is this unique thing that ArtPlace is. And I'm fascinated by two aspects of that. One is, ArtPlace is not meant to last forever. It's a 10-year project, it says. And you're in year 4, or actually just past year 4, right?
Yeah.
Technically.
Yeah.
So you're almost halfway done, which is, I think, daunting in some ways. But it has a high hope, like, okay, we're going to get it done. We're going to get this thing done. And the second thing is that it was created to not really be reliant on government, even though you did it as a government employee.
Yes, I mean, the whole idea is that it stood apart from the NEA or, you know, any federal program on its own, but working in conjunction with the NEA and other federal agencies. You know, my challenge was taking over an agency that had no money. Minuscule. You know, when I would go around the country calling our budget pathetic, Jamie, on behalf of the White House, would always hit me over the head with a 2x4.
But now I can call it pathetic.
Now he
too,
doesn't care,
so it's
right?
fabulous.
Now he says, say whatever you want. I don't care. It's not my problem. We wanted to, you know, we felt the resources of the NA were very limited, and we wanted to greatly leverage up and increase those resources. And creating an entity in the private sector that would work alongside the NEA in creative placemaking. There's a program at the NEA called Our Town that does this. Greatly multiplies the resources available. And this is something I tried to do from the beginning. As soon as I was nominated for this job, Debbie, my wife, who's had a career in philanthropy, she said, you should talk to the foundations. You should talk to the people, you know, running these foundations. You could learn a lot, because a lot of them have been doing creative placemaking for quite a while on their own, although it wasn't necessarily called that. But this might be a real leveraging opportunity for the NEA. And the first thing I did was I made an appointment with Luis Ubinius at the Ford Foundation, and started to talk to him about this. He got very excited. He said, the first thing I'm going to do is take you to PS 109, which is a project they were doing with ArtSpace, artist housing, and in the middle of Spanish Harlem, and, you know, a real engine of renovation and revitalization in that community. So he was already ready to be receptive to this notion, and especially the Ford Foundation itself. It had a great history in the arts. It was really the Ford Foundation and the NEA that started what we now know as the resident theater movement in the United States. Most of the not-for-profit theaters came in one way or another from money from the NEA and the Ford Foundation originally.
Well,
So Luis convened. We decided to bring together the biggest funders in the arts that there are. They also happen to be the biggest funders, period. So we hosted at the Ford Foundation, and Darren Walker had moved over to the Ford Foundation around that time and was a big advocate for creative placemaking and for this. And we convened the biggest arts funders that we knew, which was Mellon and Bloomberg and Knight and McKnight, and the biggest funders that we knew, and Kresge. And we had them all sit around the table, and we said, can we create an entity? Can we pool our resources together? And foundations rarely do things in cooperation or collaboration with each other. But we said, can we put together an entity where we will do this work together and do it in a way that won't depend on NEA funding, won't depend on the NEA timetable, who's in the administration, any of that. This will be a freestanding institution that will support this work of creative placemaking. And sure enough, everybody signed up, and ArtPlace was created.
You know, when I'm listening to you, first of all, just a Ford Foundation, theater, dance too. New York City Ballet, School of American Ballet. I mean, this is all because of the visionaries at Ford Foundation, McNeil Lowry. That plan, which just really created the ground that
he was a visionary.
We stood,
No
it was
question.
incredible. But that idea that you described to me, going to Washington and applying, frankly, an artistic sensibility to this thing, to say, how are we going to get this show on? Well, we're not going to do it with our own money. So, and I always looked at you. And
I'm a
say
producer.
to you,
You gotta raise
you're a
money.
producer. You're like, where are we going to get we're going to go over to Housing and Urban Development. That's what we're going to do. We're going to take some of their money. And this idea of pooling resources for a greater good, to my mind, was really an artistic intervention.
I never
if
thought
you
of it
will.
that way.
I love that. So let's go then to the 4-year mark. How's it going?
Great question, great question.
So I think really well, and I'm still in that sort of sweet spot of a honeymoon period where I'm still getting to take credit for the work that other people have done. So I can feel sort of very proud with not a lot of ego. But if if our goal is that repositioning of art and culture as a core sector of community planning and development, one of the things that we sort of think is a proxy is how many people are using that phrase, creative placemaking. How much has that entered into the lexicon? And I was at an event recently, and someone suggested that our work will be done when Microsoft Word stops underlining it as a misspelling. And
On my computer, they say creative plate making.
Right.
Always.
Right.
That's
Right.
right.
Creative plate making.
Creative plate making, creative pacemakers, creative lace making. I mean, I've had them all. But what's interesting is exactly what you were talking about with that New School course, right? There's a course about creative placemaking in Harlem being taught at the New School. You can go to the Ohio State University and get a certificate in creative placemaking. The Kresge Foundation has adopted that framework for its arts giving. The state of California and the state of Connecticut have adopted that framework. It's turned into a thing. And what was amazing was to have been in the room when Rocco and Joan Shigeakawa and Markuson and others sort of decided, let's put a name on this work that really is ancient, right? This work has been going on as long as you can think of, but let's name it, let's call it something, and let's make it a thing. And over the last 5 years, I've seen creative placemaking come out of its air quotes, right? It's no longer creative placemaking, it's now creative placemaking. And so I think things are going really well.
I mean, this was an obvious strategy, it seems to me, to find the one intersection where, the one place where the arts and the real world intersect, where there's nothing rarefied about what's happening with creative placemaking. And so it's a case you can make in the administration, it's a case you can make in Congress, it's a case you can make in the private sector. And it has a reach and an impact that's somewhat unique in the arts, because so much of it is public and accessible. I mean, I thought it was a watershed moment when it was announced the other day that the Bloomberg Foundation is going to make these challenge grants of, I think, $1 million each. I mean, big money in 4 or 5 cities for temporary public art installations. The fantastic thing about this, to me, is that if someone is walking by a public art installation, a Marc de Souvero sculpture that's in a, not to embarrass you, that's Kate's husband, that's in a public place, that's on a street or in a park, what's the cost of admission to that? 0. You're not paying to enter a theater or a museum or anything. All you have to do is walk by. It's free. You intersect with that work of art, and it can change your point of view. It can brighten your day. You can ignore it, whatever. But there is a relationship to a work of art when the art is public, when the art is simply out there, that doesn't happen normally with the arts, where generally you have to buy a ticket to see something. So it's a natural point where art can really have a wide reach. A beautiful piece of architecture, a piece of sculpture, whatever it is, that is out in the public realm, is accessed by people who wouldn't consider themselves patrons of the arts.
So where does it cross the line from the mentality issue of that's a luxury, and we don't need that luxury right now, we have other things.
It's not a luxury that's accessible to everyone.
But just in terms of the decision to want to partake in this. Now, I think what you said, I totally understand about the mayors. I've met some of these mayors. I've seen how this goes on. But in the end, choices are made. And you described earlier the mental switch. And why don't you tell them what you said to the kids, which was amazing.
To the kids.
So they were students, so they're kids.
So my background is as a fundraiser. So that was, my first several jobs were raising money in the arts, New York Philharmonic, Museum of Modern Art, Columbia College, those sorts of places. And during that entire period, I would talk about the arts, but the only thing I was talking about was what we didn't have, which was money, right? So I was opening up with our lack, with our scarcity, and I was essentially spending every conversation with my hand out. So not surprisingly, that's not a wildly effective way to begin any partnership. And it's also totally disingenuous to what all of us who are arts people recognize, which is the huge array of benefits that accrue to individuals and to communities when art happens. And I was working with Rocco down in Washington, so you sort of take on a very, a certain air. I've watched The West Wing, and I've read, all those things, so you sort of get into presidential mode.
Did you want to be Josh or?
I wanted to be CJ.
Oh, CJ. Okay.
I was Rocco's communications flack, and also the actress who plays CJ and I have the same hair cutter. So very connected.
Very natural.
Yes,
Yeah,
right.
yeah.
Yeah. So Allison Janney, Jamie Bennett, same thing. But so the way we would talk about it when we were down there was, we sort of took on a Kennedy air, and we said, it's no longer ask what your country can do for the arts. It's now ask what the arts can do for your country. And so the other bit of the story I told was I was spending a lot of time in a car this weekend. I was visiting an amazing thing in Reedsburg, Wisconsin, about an hour north of Madison, the Farm Art Detour, where artists and farmers collaborate on this 50-mile circuit of art installations and food installations and produce installations. So I was spending a lot of time in the car, and I had the radio on. And Garrison Keillor came on, and it was pledge drive, so he was shilling for public radio. And he used the definition of fundraising that I'd never heard before, which is that he said successful fundraising is an agreement between two people that each has something the other needs. And that's what I think is the genius of the turn that Rocco did, the sort of rhetorical flourish of saying the arts can do something for you, we need you to do something for the arts, one trade. And it became this sort of fair exchange.
Right.
In a way that was a powerful thing that I hadn't seen in my years of writing grants and sort of having the tin cup and doing all of that sort of stuff.
Let's turn to the artists themselves within that equation.
Mm-hmm.
Because in many ways, if you imagine, the arts district, you can picture the public art piece, perhaps. You can picture the opening of a gallery, which leads to the opening of a restaurant, and you start to have this kind of sequence of events that goes on. But, Kate referenced the Soho effect, and that came up with one of the urban planning students upstairs, and how there is a perception in many ways that the artists themselves that make the change end up getting pushed out of the places that they've enlivened. And that brings up issues of equity. Where does this happen? What are these places afterwards? I'm looking at Cora, who has, Kahan, we spoke about you earlier in New 42nd Street and the Joyce, and how those projects were a learning curve, that you learn from one to the next. The idea that you can build in the success for the artist if you choose to. Mm-hmm. And how much thinking goes into that aspect of it? Because you referenced a story about Baltimore, and they said, please God, gentrification, we'll take it.
Yeah.
But what do you think?
I mean, Soho is Soho. It's a very rarefied district. Most of the stuff that we encounter is something far different. The over the Rhine district in Cincinnati, which not too long ago was basically one big police action. Crack cocaine sales, prostitution, car theft, you name it. It was a place you just didn't go. Then an art gallery opened, and a piece of public artist housing was put in. Then another gallery, then a restaurant, then a theater, and now people take their dates and walk along the street and stroll there and eat outside, and the place has economic and every other kind of vitality. There are 1,000 examples I can give you in Columbus, Ohio, wherever, St. Louis, my hometown, where the arts have transformed a place just by being there. One of the things cities need more than anything else is foot traffic on the streets, particularly at night. Many cities like St. Louis were basically hollowed out business districts that just went dead closed at night. The arts can change those places profoundly. And that's the case that has to be made without worrying. There are ways to deal with the equity situation in a place like Soho, but most places aren't like that. The example you mentioned in Baltimore is perfect. And I showed up in Baltimore with Sean Donovan. And what was the district? North Station District?
Station North.
Station North District in Baltimore. It's basically a war zone. I mean, it looks like it's a place you just wouldn't think of ever going, much less living. And HUD was funding some artist housing there in the middle of this district. And we did a whole, thing, to announce it and celebrate it and so forth. And I said to the mayor of Baltimore, I said, so, and this place was rough, believe me. I said, so you're going to have artist housing and galleries and you'll have gentrification. And she said, please God. Most districts, most places, desperately need some kind of activity and foot traffic and people feeling safe and people wanting to go there, and the arts can do that.
Jamie, maybe you want to follow up on that and just discuss, I mean, artist housing as a topic is one of great interest in that to me. It's like bringing the artist housing, so they're actually living there, they're taking ownership of the community, but then that leads to there's space for this housing. This is not a situation where, I mean, you talked about San Francisco.
Yeah, I mean, what's interesting is I think any conversation about community development eventually ends up in a conversation about gentrification. And interestingly enough, art-centric community development gets to gentrification instantly. There's something about it that people sort of instantly say the phrase, artists move to a neighborhood, poof, gentrification. And I've spent a lot of time trying to unpack that. And there are some assumptions baked into that formation that I think are problematic. And then landing on gentrification I think is problematic because I don't think it leads to solutions. So some of the assumptions are problematic is that creative placemaking only happens when artists move to a neighborhood. Well, there are lots of artists who live in neighborhoods, right? Artists are people. They're our neighbors. They're in neighborhoods. So that's problematic. People also talk about community as if it's a durable, permanent thing, right? That a community is 100 people live in 100 houses for 100 years, and it never changes. Every community has in and out migration patterns. But what the piece that I think is helpful is I found that if people have a conversation about gentrification, it leads to a room full of people wringing their hands and saying, oh, that's a shame, it's too bad. Someone should really do something about that. So what we're trying to do at ArtPlace is reframe the conversation to what the problem actually is. And that problem is displacement, right? The problem isn't where the gentry do or do not live. The problem is, do other people also have a choice, an equitable choice about where to live? And we've seen at least 3 kinds of displacement happen in communities. We've seen physical displacement, right? San Francisco is full. There are oil towns in the Dakotas that are full. If I want to move there tomorrow, someone has to move out first. So if I move there, I'm physically displacing someone. But in many cities, like Baltimore or Detroit, you arguably have twice as much city as you need for the current population. So you also have to think about economic displacement, right? If I'm not a homeowner, if I'm renting and property values go up, I might be economically displaced. I might no longer be able to afford to live in my neighborhood. And then the third kind of displacement that I think is important and needs a lot of attention is cultural displacement, right? What happens when someone no longer feels that they are welcome in their own neighborhood? And some colleagues of mine were just in Minneapolis at Juxtaposition Arts, which is an extraordinary organization. And one of the things that they were talking about, which is an issue that I hadn't framed this way, is that a lot of creative placemaking is getting citizens to hang out in public spaces, right? That's sort of the goal. We want to bring that foot traffic, the eyes on the street, and all of that. But what they pointed out is a lot of the population they work with aren't read in the same way as other parts of the population when they're in open space. That if you're particularly a man of color, you loitering in a public space is not read as the same thing as me as a white man in a suit sitting on a bench reading a newspaper. So we also have to think about, as the character of a neighborhood changes, are we prepared to see everyone who lives in that neighborhood inhabiting the public spaces? So I think we need to frame those conversations around displacement because that's actionable, right? We can normalize seeing every kind of citizen in a public space. We can learn from San Francisco, from the Community Arts Stabilization Trust, and look at models that mean that we no longer have to economically displace people. So I find that framework is more useful because I think it can lead to action and lead to solutions.
Also, I don't think that an increase in property values is always an unadulterated evil. You know, the reason the mayor of Baltimore said, please God, is because she would like to have some tax base there, some economic activity going on, understandably so.
The actual work that you incentivize or sponsor in various ways and encourage, how limited was the conception in the beginning? I know you've said anyone can apply. There's some issues with how you get the money. You have to have some sort of fiscal vehicle for that. But what's the range of things? Did you say, I think we better focus in this way, this is how we're going to focus, or was it open? What did you think?
So it was fairly open. You may have some sense of Rocco, those of you who didn't know him going into this in our time together. He liked short words and short sentences, right? I mean, get the idea out, get it out quickly. So the idea was that we were going to invest in projects that were doing art to transform a place. And it was meant to be that open, right? That you should draw a circle on a map and define a community, some group of people related by geography. You should talk about some
place,
change,
a place,
right? So literally draw a circle on a map, all the people who live, work, and play in that circle. What is some change that group of people would like to see? What is something that needs to be fixed, something that needs to be improved, something that needs to be continued, something, opportunity that needs to be seized? Propose an arts-based intervention to achieve that change, and then be prepared to know whether you've succeeded. And it was really that simple. We were looking to invest in people that were doing art in order to change a place.
And what are the patterns that have emerged in terms of what the typical, is there a top three type of project that goes, oh, this is us?
So it's really interesting to sort of watch we get in about 1,300 applications a year, from which we make about 55 grants, so hugely competitive. And it puts us in this very privileged position of seeing what's going on across the country. And there are these fascinating themes that emerged. One year, everyone was activating public plazas, right? Everyone had an empty public plaza, needed to activate it with visual art, with performing art, with activity, great.
And just let me cut in there. And when you say they're activating them, were they applying for funding to do it, or were they doing it anyway and they wanted some money?
Some of both. I mean, the bad news about ArtPlace is we have a 4% funding rate. The good news is it's big chunks of money. Our average grant is $330,000. So it's enough money to get something done, right, to get a project really done. And so these were folks, in the 70s in particular, we built lots of public spaces that were terrible, right? We built places that were designed not to have people in them. And shockingly, we succeeded. We now have a world filled with public spaces that have people in them. So we wanted to bring people back to public space. And what was so interesting is the year after the public plaza activations, I think we could claim success because the next round of applications were all about alleyway activations, right? We succeeded in the plazas, and we now need to get the alleyways activated, going out. This past year, we saw a lot of really interesting work being done around former Superfund sites, so sites of environmental disasters. There's one of my favorite projects is in a suburb in western Massachusetts. A chemical dye company polluted a plot of land. And an artist has now come in and is going to plant a polychromatic garden on top of that chemical dye. So the colors that are poisoning the ground are now going to be the colors of the living plants on top of it that's remediating it and turning it into an asset for the community. I mean, I just think the poetry of that is so beautiful. But a former brownfield in Austin that's being redeveloped using the Fuse Box Festival as a living charrette. Stormwater basins in the middle of the Dakotas that are being turned into community space for art and activity. So you do see themes, and I have no idea if it's coincidence, if it really is something in the zeitgeist, if we are sort of working through first the alleyways. You know, first they came for the plazas, then they came for the alleyways.
Rocco, when you were dreaming this up, you probably discarded some things. I'd always be curious to know what you said. No, we're not going to do that. We're not going to do this. But I'd also love to know what you thought of. I know you've discussed, the idea of matching grants being essential. I have done a share of that myself through the Jerome Robbins Foundation, trying to stimulate interest in further funding. What works in this financial model differently in your mind than
one thing
with
is
your
you
producer
don't
hat?
have a grant application process that is completely discouraging. One of the problems at the NEA is that it's a very cumbersome. We tried to streamline this, clean it up, and Joan did a lot of work on that. But Congress still had so many mandates and regulations that it's a complex application process. You want to be able to basically write on a sheet of paper what you're going to do, why, what money you need, and to keep it fairly simple. And ArtPlace, because it's not a governmental agency, can do that. And I think that's important. And you don't have to be any, as Jamie has and will explain, you don't have to be any particular thing to apply. You could be an individual. You could be a city. You could be a not-for-profit organization. Any number of entities can apply for it, which is great.
Does it have a matching component? Is there any requirement for any of that? Is there anything?
I don't believe there is per se. No.
Not per.
You encourage it? Is there any incentivizing?
What ArtPlace does, ArtPlace encourages buy-in by all the elements of the community.
I see.
I think you have a much better chance of getting a grant from ArtPlace if the political structure is involved, if the private sector, their philanthropy, individuals are involved. Individuals are involved, the not-for-profit organizations are involved. The more buy-in, the better.
And the interesting bit of that, which is maybe counterintuitive to some, is it's easier often to pull that off in rural settings in small towns.
Right.
So we do a site visit to every application we receive for every finalist that we name. And one of the things we talk about is you should bring in sort of show the partnership, show the community buy-in. And you go to a smaller community and the mayor shows up and a couple city council people show up. We had one town in Alaska we visited, 15% of the population showed up for the site visit, right? And you really get a sense that the community is bought in, the community supports this. This is a project that the community wants to do. And then you compare that with a site visit to an unnamed major cultural institution in a major cultural metropolis, whose site visit consisted of a director of development and a project manager, talking about how important the institution was to their community. And just those visuals, just sort of who shows up for the site visit is so important, but it really does sort of bring out that it's hard to work on community scale in New York City. We're 8.3 million people now. That's awfully hard to pull off. Being a town of 761, Lanesboro, Minnesota, it's much easier to really speak with the community and sort of have a project being done by them.
I think that when I picture an ArtPlace project, I'm stuck a little bit, I have to say, on the public art, the transformation of the plaza, the community that is transformed by the series of artistic businesses of various kinds, theater, gallery. But I keep coming back a little bit to the human side of it, and I read about the public space in North Shore, California, which unites 4 disconnected North Shore neighborhoods and will use art interventions to discover new ways of connecting residents. So I'd be curious to know what
right?
what the...
No one has a clue what that project
Yeah,
is.
well, this... Sorry,
Right. And I think, did I write that?
I
I'm worried
sprang
that
this
I
on
wrote
you
that.
a little bit.
Right.
My staff may have made it up.
Right.
I'm not sure.
No.
But I
So
don't
this
think
is this is unincorporated Riverside, California. So it's a community that's not technically a community. And for folks who do know it, if you do find someone who knows this part of North Shore, California, say, what do you know about it? And they say, oh, they have a poisoned lake full of dead fish, right? So this is a group of people that are living in a place that's not a place by many. Those who do know it think it is the worst place on earth to live. And so shockingly, it can be depressing living there, right? Shockingly.
Yeah.
So this amazing group, the Kankui Design Collective, has come together and started working with the community and said, what's going on? What do you like? What do you want more of? What are some of the good things about living here? There's lots of space. There's places to do things. We can come together. People have great stories. People have great music. And so they started getting to know the people who are in the community. And through that process, they actually helped create an identity for that community. A group of people who sort of lived next to each other being depressed turned into a community that began to have an identity, right? We are this community. And then they started talking about the amenities that they would like to see in their community, and they started building them. And they started building, when we were in DC, a close colleague was Tom Vilsack, who's the Secretary of the US Department of Agriculture. And he talks about the need, particularly in rural communities, particularly in distressed communities, of needing campfire moments, right? We need these little sparks of light that bring the community together in a circle. And he thinks that the arts can provide that. You have an art exhibition, you have a public performance, you have a pop-up, ballet performance, something like that. People show up and start sort of being together in the space and remembering that they're connected. So that's one that involved essentially zero capital, right? There was no new building, but it was really sort of bringing people together and bringing them around temporary pieces of art and temporary performances. So it's an extraordinary, extraordinary project, and Kankui is an extraordinary collaborative.
Well, I like the idea of that, and I want to know more about exactly what they're doing, what the artistic interventions are, so we can talk about that. I want to do one jump off, though. They're an extraordinary collaborative. How important is quality in all this? I mean, there's been
It's essential.
There's been issues about the NEA and individual artists, we all know from the past. There's been issues about how one judges, 50 states, how much should one state get? Is it all equal? You had this baptism by fire when you went to the NEA. How does that relate to this, the idea of it?
I think, well, Jamie can talk to it. I think you have to have the highest quality work. That seems to me a given.
Do you have...
Yeah, I mean, in our so this, I'm talking purely at this point within the framework of creative placemaking, right? People who are doing art to transform a place. So we're going to measure the success of that grant or the success of that investment by the transformation to place. Mm-hmm. However, as Rocco was saying, crappy art leads to crappy outcomes, right? I mean, if you're a doctor, you use a piece of equipment and you're trying to make someone better. If you have a crappy piece of equipment, the person's probably not going to get well as quickly.
Putting up bad murals isn't going to
Right. So I think that, so the way we talk about it is that artistic quality is necessary, but not sufficient for creative placemaking to succeed. Because you need the artistic quality, but you need it within the community context and within the community intention. Mm-hmm. And one of the things that I think some people fall into, and there was that great sort of connoisseurship moment that, was it Rob Storr and Dick Feigen sort of had that conversation. And I think sometimes there are some people that sometimes conflate quality with taste. And that they're not, those two things are not the same thing. And there is such thing as a quality work of art that I don't like. But I don't get to call it not a good work of art. I get to say I don't like it. So I think we need to be careful in some of our language, because I think, I was just in Denver, Colorado, talking with
the
local...
word that gets used. It's junk.
Yeah, but it's, Madeline Grinstein, who runs the Museum of Contemporary Art in Chicago, talks about it as often the arts world needs to retain our expertise while learning to relinquish control, right? Madeline Grinstein will always know more about contemporary art than Jamie Bennett, but Jamie Bennett is still entitled to his personal experience of it. Just because Pollock was a great artist doesn't mean I have to like it. I have to understand it, I have to be able to talk about it, it has a right to exist, but it doesn't mean I need to look at it. Interesting. And I like Jackson Pollock, I'm just he's dead, so it's safe to pick on.
Okay, we have a few minutes left, so we're going to open up to questions. We have microphones, so if you raise your hand, I'll call on you. I have to ask, please make it a question, because we have limited time. Rocco is not only prone to short declarative sentences, he also famously had a meter in his office which ran out and you were out.
A parking meter.
Parking meter, you put in a quarter, you get a half hour.
Right.
That's no meeting should last longer than a half hour.
I think ever. You can guarantee that if you don't have a question, the bell's going to ring or something. That'll happen. So if you have a question, please raise your hand and we will take it from there. Right here, right in the front, and the microphone is coming to you.
Sure. What is the principal resistance to your effort?
Great question. What do you find to be the most resistance right now? What's in the way of this?
So I've been accused of being a sort of ignorant Pollyanna. I mean, I like seeing the good and I like seeing the positive. I don't see a lot of resistance, because the fundamental frame for creative placemaking is coming up to another sector in a community and saying, what are you trying to do? How can I help you? And that's a pretty easy opening, right? As opposed to, I'm important, I don't have any money, give me some money. If instead the frame is, what are you trying to do, how can I help? There's not a lot of resistance. So the structural problem is that the rooms that I need to get into are the rooms of people who don't think about the arts, right? You all showed up for a conversation about creative placemaking. You're a group of people I don't ever need to speak with again, right? You've got it, you think about the arts, you're oriented that way. I need to get the people who looked at this invitation and said, oh, I'm never going to that. So I would say the biggest hurdle is figuring out the bait and switch, right? How do I create something that people show up for and then spring the art on them?
There are going to be people who always think the arts shouldn't be funded no matter what and have no impact and isn't a real thing. I remember when the stimulus package was announced, $50 million was given to the NEA to spend, and I remember watching television. This is before I was at the NEA. Watching television, and a senator who shall go nameless, Jack Kingston of Georgia, got on television. He said, how can you spend $50 million on the arts when that money could be spent creating real jobs like road building? So that you get some of that kind of really moronic talk.
And that's so the answer is you just don't think there is a huge amount of resistance, except getting into the right rooms.
Getting into the right rooms, and then, I mean, if someone comes up to you and says, Damian, what are you trying to do? Can I help you with that?
Yeah, I'm very standoffish, but...
Well, you are,
no,
yeah.
no, actually...
Ever since you left the Corps de Ballet.
That's right, that was time. Please, right.
Did the success of the Gates help was a watershed event that really changed people's minds because it was so successful and generated, Bloomberg said something like $300 million in economic benefit?
Absolutely. So this is a dangerous question to answer because normally I quote Kate Levin, and I'm now sitting in a room with Kate Levin. And I would also like to point out I'm sitting in a room with 3 former bosses. So Rocco's here on stage with me, Kate Levin is here, and Aggie Gund is sitting up there. So 3 extraordinary people I've had.
I think that
time
that's
to
an
work with.
incredible testament to Jamie, I have to say.
It's
To
why I
be
nibble on
surrounded
Xanax
by
constantly.
former bosses,
Never know who's going
and they're here willingly,
Right.
is really something.
So
yeah.
what was amazing about, many things were amazing about the Gates. They were a quality piece of art. They happened to be a piece of art I liked. They had a huge economic benefit. But one of the things that Kate often talks about is they also helped change us. Because if you remember that moment in our history, the last time New York City was on the front page of every media outlet around the world was 9/11. So we were victims, we were survivors, we were a city under attack. And all of a sudden, a couple of years later, we're on the front page because we have this huge, extraordinary, out there kind of 2 weeks of magic happening in a deserted park in February. And it was one of the few times that I can remember. I lived in New York for 18 years before I came down to DC for 4, and am now back. It was one of the few times I can remember the entire city talking about something that wasn't a transit strike, that wasn't a natural disaster, that wasn't a human disaster. And, I talked about it with cab drivers, I talked about it with dog walkers, I talked about it with waiters, and everyone had an opinion. Some people loved it and some people hated it. And what was wonderful about it, and one of the things I think is so amazing about the Bloomberg Public Art Challenge, is it was temporary. It was only up there for 2 weeks, so it was okay if people hated it.
And you couldn't buy a ticket to it.
And you couldn't buy a ticket to it.
No cost.
Yeah. So I think that is an extraordinary
that
example.
Bloomberg is doing this again.
Right.
Microphone coming.
Your reference to Georgia raises a question. Are you doing as well in red America as you're doing in blue America?
I think so.
Yeah.
One of the biggest advocates for the NEA was the Republican chair of our funding committee, Mike Simpson in Idaho, big supporter of the arts. I think when you can make the case on their home turf in their district and they see how this works, they're on board. I think that
Yeah.
happens.
I mean, artists, we often talk about this. Artists are the one asset that exists in every community. Red, blue, purple, every community. Not every community has waterfront. Not every community has great public transportation. Not every community is anchored by a hospital or a university. But every community has people who sing and dance and tell stories. And if you make those artists present, and you don't make it just about Lincoln Center, but you also make it about the things that are happening everywhere, not just in travertine marble buildings, it becomes something that everyone buys into because it's fun, right? We like listening to music. We like reading stories. We like moving around. I mean, it's fun.
Absolutely. Right here.
Have you funded a project for a community that is not built around a physical geography?
So not yet. We've decided for the purpose of our grant program that we really are interested in place-based communities. And there are lots of communities in this world, right? There's a community of artists in this country. There's a community of social justice activists. There's a community of immigrants. There are many kinds of communities that are not based in a place. We're interested in the framework of creative placemaking, the place-based, right? A group of people who live, work, and play together. And there's an amazing guy, a guy called Michael Road, who's one of the founders of Sojourn Theater, who talks about a continuum of practice that goes from studio practice to social practice to civic practice to creative placemaking. And there's a lot in the social practice art movement that's dealing with other kinds of communities, communities of affinity, communities of personal identity, communities of morality. So it's a different space than the one we play in. But if you look at like A Blade of Grass, the extraordinary project that the Rubens have helped fund, or some of those other organizations, there are other folks that are working in that space.
We can go right back there.
You have 4 years left, so I hope that you'll speak to what you want to do next. But I'm wondering if the projects that you've done for the last 4+ years are creating models that you will perpetuate.
Yeah, so just quickly, we go out of business in 2020. we've been primarily known for our national grant program, but we're marrying that with a field building work, a research agenda, and some more community investments. And one of them is figuring out what are the things that have worked in one specific context that can be learned from and deployed in other contexts. So I know we're at the end of our time, but there's a great project in St. Paul, Minnesota, this one's for Adam, where they were building a new light rail station. And that light rail station was great. A light rail line, the Green Line, was going to be great when it reopened. But during the 2 or 3 years that it was under construction, it stunk for everyone in the community. Living next to construction stunk. If you were a business owner in that community, your life stunk just as much, plus you had no customers coming. And for the people who were building the rail line, you were teaching people to avoid that neighborhood, not come to it, right? You were sort of branding it as a traffic snarl place with no parking. So a great group called Springboard for the Arts trained 600 artists on how to partner with local businesses and community organizations and said, go out and do something, do anything, we don't care what you do, just do it along the Green Line corridor. And over 2 years, those artists produced 150 events that were a jazz concert in a Thai restaurant, or a dance class in an insurance company parking lot, or a stained glass installation along a fence. And what they discovered is that those 150 events generated 30 million positive media impressions. So all of a sudden, rather than thinking that it lives next to construction, I live in a cool neighborhood. All of a sudden, rather than losing customers to the Walgreens across town that still has parking, people were coming to this neighborhood that was happening. And most importantly for the project, people were getting in the habit of coming to that neighborhood. It was being rebranded as a destination. So that technique, that tactic of how Springboard trains local artists and employs them to partner with local businesses and communities, I think can work in any community that's been disrupted by natural disaster, by construction, by blight. You know, in Baltimore, the mayor could find a partner to train artists and deploy them along the Station North neighborhood and get folks to sort of change the identity of that neighborhood, bring more foot traffic there, bring new identity there. So it's something we're hugely interested in, and I'd love to talk more.
I mean, what we're hearing, in a sense, is about strategy building. These are strategies, these are toolkits, and the organization you referenced, Springboard for the Arts, has actually created something called the Creative Exchange, which is a method of distributing these toolkits, which you can go online and look at, and it's just one after another. It's ways to enliven your community, whether it's to combat blight or a construction project, or you name it, you know, simply ways to engage through the arts. Because I think that sometimes simply thinking, oh, that sounds good, but nobody knows what to do. You know, there's like that moment of, well, what exactly would I do to make this happen? You referenced earlier with the students that it's a mentality switch of a sort that, and I always try and think, I'm looking at all of you and thinking, okay, well, some of you are in this business in some way or another, and some of you are just interested in the ideas of arts and policy, or, you know, I'm not exactly sure why some of you are here. But I hope, though, that there might be a way to say that everybody walks out of here and says, oh, I see how I intersect with that, or I might have that idea that I can bring that, how can I help you with that, to whatever I'm doing. And it's funny how it seems a part of daily, like, okay, that's what it is, and then it's not, because I run into it myself. When I'm tackling a problem on something, I sometimes remind myself, oh, wait, I have a great artistic solution to this one. And what Jamie used with the students earlier, which is what I was trying to get you to say before, so I'm just going to repeat it. He said, you can't believe it, but 20 years ago, if we were sitting here, there'd be 3 ashtrays on this table. And they looked at us like we were crazy. But of course, it's true. You know, they would have been. And it's a shocking change of mentality. And if we could achieve some mentality that's not about forbidding something, but about being available for something, that would be a huge thing that I think that you're doing and what you created. So with that, I'd like to thank you both for doing this. And I want to thank you all for coming.